Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Keegan. I'm a front-end dev with Deloitte Digital. Thanks, Jack and Laura, for some great presentations just before this. I'm going to continue with the front-end dev theme and focus specifically on Inline SVG in Drupal. So I love Inline SVG as an icon format. It's sharp and precise, it's efficient and lightweight, and it's just code. So you can open your image in your code editor, make some changes, save it out, and you don't lose any image quality. Today I'm going to demonstrate 4 methods of using Inline SVG in Drupal. I'll show you the benefits of each one, and I'll also give you a couple of tips along the way to get the most out of your SVG. First, I just want to clarify what I mean with Inline SVG, because there's a lot of different ways of using SVG. I'm not talking about using image elements. I'm not talking about using CSS background images. But I'm talking about putting the SVG element directly into your DOM, like you can see in that third screenshot. And the main advantage here is that we can then style that SVG with CSS and interact with it with JavaScript. So the first method that I want to start with today is by writing an SVG directly into a Twig template. So I'm going to do some semi-live coding, and we're going to write an SVG to change the appearance of these radio buttons. So at the moment you can see we've just got the default browser native appearance of the radios, but I'm going to insert an SVG so that we can completely change that. On the right hand side here, we've got a Twig template targeting the label elements for radio buttons. So it's not going to affect these other labels, but just the ones that are associated with the radio buttons. By default, we just have some text in there, the title, but this is where we're going to put the SVG. So there's the semi-live coding. So what we've just created here is an empty SVG container. We've got a view box, which is specifying like the canvas area of that SVG. This is giving it a width of 20 and a height of 20. And I've also put a width attribute on there, which is important as well. So the view box will allow us to resize that SVG with CSS, but the width attribute will provide a sensible default. If the CSS doesn't load, like if there's a network error or something, if that width attribute wasn't there, then the SVG would just expand to fill up the entire, like as wide as it can. So sometimes you'll see, like, if you load up a site and then your connection drops out while it's loading, the icons are just enormous, taking up the whole screen. It's because they haven't put this width attribute on. There's no need to put a height attribute on there, because if you've got the view box, the browser knows what the ratio of the image is, so it'll calculate that height for you. Then we'll put a couple of circles in there. These have both got center coordinates of 10 and 10, so they're right in the middle of the view box. And the first circle has a radius of 9, so it's taking up almost the entire view box. By default, it will have a fill of black. So that's this black, yeah, well, that's the outside black circle that you see there. The second circle has the same coordinates, but a radius of just 5, so it's a bit smaller. The fill is white, and so we get this effect with a white circle on a black circle. The next step, I want to add a couple of class names. Well, I have to do some actual live coding. So the class of the black circle we'll put on radio border. And then we'll put on a class name of radio dot on the white circle. So that's going to allow us to theme these in CSS. So we'll jump into a style sheet and color them blue. So we can see that's coming through into our web page. But I mean, it looks okay, but obviously this is showing the selected state of the radio. By default, you want a radio to appear unselected. So we'll just change that radius of the dot to be 0. So now those radios are unselected. And we want them to only have a larger radius when the associated radio button is selected. So we'll say, if this dot is inside a label element, which is adjacent to a radio button that's checked, then we want it to have a radius of 5. So So now if I go and click these radio buttons, we can see that that's having the effect that we want. Now, of course, because this is just CSS, we can use transitions. So we'll pop a transition on the radius of 200 milliseconds. And now that effect of growing from 0 to 5 is animated and nice and smooth. And of course, we want to think about keyboard users as well. So we'll add a focus state on the radios. So when I'm a keyboard user and I'm tabbing through this form, that didn't work.
Can you just scroll the page up a little bit there? So we can see the
Yep. Thanks. Okay, so now we can see when I'm focused on the radios, they're being highlighted in green. And finally, I'm happy with that styling, so I'll just hide the native element. So I'll just say, grab the native radio, give it an opacity of 0 and a width of 0. So now this is the finished product. Now the benefits of this example are the image was a tiny file size. The amount of code we had to write for that icon was very small, probably less HTML than the input element itself. No HTTP requests were required to load the image. It was embedded into the document. And we certainly didn't need to load additional images for hover states or focus states. Being stylable with CSS, we could use animations, and if we wanted to, hook into our variables to make sure we're using the correct colors. Being a vector image, of course, it's always sharp, no matter how high resolution the screen is. And we could do things like resize it on touch screens to make it easier to tap. And we wouldn't need to load in a different image file. Now, I just want to give you a little tip about making your SVGs appear as good as they possibly can. Here we've got an SVG, 10 pixels wide, 4 pixels tall. We've got 2 rectangles in there. The first one takes up the full view box, and the second one is 1 pixel in from each edge. This is showing it magnified 20 times, so that grid in the background is representing physical pixels. So you can see that the black borders are 1 pixel thick, and they're aligning perfectly with the grid. But the problem is, if we want to scale this icon up to, say, 150%, that 1 pixel thick black border will need to have a width of 1.5 pixels. But you can't really divide physical pixels on the screen. So what the browser will do is anti-alias that. And if you zoom in 20 times, it looks a little bit like this. So you could describe it as having blurry edges. And it looks okay, but it's not perfect. So what I would rather do is enlarge it 200%, and then those 1 pixel thick lines have a width of 2 pixels, and they're aligning nicely on the grid. So, I mean, the tip here is design your icons at the actual size that they're going to be displayed. And if you use a third-party icon library, render the icons at the size they're provided. However, take this with a grain of salt, because the big advantage of SVG is it's scalable, and you should continue to scale your images when you need to, but be aware of what's happening and look out for those blurry edges. The next method I want to look at is using SVG fields and formatters in Drupal. So there's a couple of good modules out there which will allow you to upload SVGs into fields and then render them out as a formatter, as an inline SVG. So this is good if you want to allow your content authors to upload SVGs, but usually, in my experience, we don't want to give content authors that much freedom. We want to have a degree of control over which icons are displayed. So I don't typically use this approach. If you're interested in these modules, you can grab my slides at the end, and that'll include links to them. But right now, I'll skip on to the next method. So this is probably today the most popular method of using inline SVG, not just in Drupal, but overall. But it's not necessarily the best. The approach works like this. When you want to display an icon, you insert a reference to the icon definition at the top. So that's where we're saying we're using that use element with an href link to the icon apple. And then you define your icons further down or somewhere else in the page. And so down here we've got, in the second block of code, a symbol definition for the icon apple. That's defining its own view box, and then the actual SVG data with those three paths. Now in this example I've only got one symbol there, but typically you'd put a whole lot of symbols into that one definition and then reference them whenever you want to use them. Those definitions could actually be put into a standalone SVG file, so then you get the benefits of being able to load all your icons in one file and then cache that file. So then whenever you reference an icon, you're not having to make an additional request. So that's a bit of a similar paradigm to image sprites. How it actually works is that inside that use element, the browser will create a shadow DOM with the source of the icon. So you can see that works. We're getting the Apple icon showing up at the bottom. However, it is in a shadow DOM, and that brings some serious restrictions. So we're really limited in how we can style that with CSS, and we can't interact with it at all with JavaScript. CSS inheritance still applies, so we could, for instance, set a fill or a stroke property on the use element outside the shadow DOM, and that would be inherited by the elements within. So we could make the whole icon green if we wanted to, but we can't target these elements within the shadow DOM directly. So we can't say, even though that third path has a class name of leaf, we can't target it with that class name and color the leaf in green, but the fruit in red and the stick brown, because those class names are in a shadow DOM. Our CSS file on the outer page doesn't have access to those. To make it even more complex, if these elements have a presentation attribute, like in the radio button example at the start, we had fill equals white on the inner circle. And in that example, we were able to override it with CSS. However, here we're talking about having inherited properties from the use element. So actually, presentation attributes will override inherited styles. So, I mean, if you really wanted to, you could put fill equals green on this leaf element, and then it would show up in green, but then it would always be green everywhere you use this icon, and you wouldn't be able to override it with CSS. So in summary, for this method, there's some benefits if you put those definitions into an external file. You'll get caching benefits in the browser, and there's some good modules out there that will build up the definitions for you when you upload SVG icons. But on the downside, you're then loading up all the images up front rather than just the ones you need, and your CSS is severely limited. So I would question whether the conventional wisdom of combining images into sprites is really the best approach for inline SVG. I mean, it came about in a day when we were making separate HTTP requests for each icon, and that included like hover states and focus states. With inline SVG, that's not the case at all. The icons are embedded into the DOM, and there are no HTTP requests. And so it's severely restricting our creativity as well with CSS. So there are some downsides. The final method I want to look at today is embedding external icon files into Twig templates. So an approach I like to use is to create a folder in my templates directory in my theme where I put all of the SVG icons. And so here I've got a few icons in a DrupalSouth theme folder. The first line of code is showing we're using the include statement from Twig to render one of those icons inline. So typically you use the inline, the include statement to include a Twig template, but it works just as well for including SVG files as well. So it'll read out that file and inject it inline into your template. I mean, you can also make this work for content authourable icons where the content author can select which icon they want. So that second line of code is showing we're just putting a variable name in to where it's looking for the icon. So Drupal will then include an icon by that name. if you use that approach, it's a good idea to use the ignore missing option as well, because then if no file can be found that matches that name, it just won't include anything rather than blowing up the page. So we used link class, which is a module that normally allows content authors to select from, or to add class names to their links. So you can write out a list of possible class names that you want them to be able to choose from, and then it'll present that in a drop-down for the content authors. Then we just added a Twig template so that instead of adding a class name, it would include the relevant SVG inline. I want to give you one more tip before finishing this, and that's around using this optimization tool. Here's the source code of an icon from a commercial icon library. So as you can see, there's a lot of code up there, and the point is, a lot of the code up there is actually not necessary, or you wouldn't want it in an inline SVG. So if I black all that code out, you're left with this. And even here, there's a lot of repetition in the SVG. If I highlight all those attributes, they're repeated 5 times, like one time on each of the shapes. There's no need for that in SVG. You can use a G element or a group, and then put those presentation elements on the group, and they'll apply to everything inside it. So you could go and fix this up manually, but if you've got a whole lot of icons, it's going to take a lot of time, and also there'll be a high chance of inconsistencies along the way. So that's when it makes sense to use something like SVGO. Have I got time to do a quick...
You got 2 minutes.
Oh, that's right, 2 minutes. Yep. So I'll just show you what SVGO looks like. You install it with npm, or you can use it through gulp or grunt or whatever workflow you want to use. I'll just show you the inside of this SVG file. It's pretty messy. It came from that same icon library. Let's just run it through SVGO. For input, we'll put in the file name. For output, for the demo, we'll just render it out to the terminal. And then a good option to use is pretty, which instead of minifying the icon, it gives each element its own line. So straight away, that's a much nicer SVG. So SVGO has pretty good defaults out of the box, but it's very configurable as well. And one configuration that I would always make with inline SVG is to disable one of the plugins that removes the viewbox attribute. You need the viewbox attribute if you want to be able to resize your icons with CSS. So I would always say disable equals remove viewbox. And now we get the same result, but we have a viewbox attribute on that SVG. So it's a great plugin, very configurable, and you can get it to clean up your SVGs and put them into the format that you want. So in conclusion, these are the 4 methods that I've gone over. They each have their own advantages for embedding inline SVG into Drupal. But I just want to reiterate that 4th method, embedding external icons into Twig templates, is going to maximize your creative freedom in styling those SVGs with CSS. And it also allows content authors to select from a list of icons. Thanks.